Well, good morning, church. Thank you for joining us for the Daily Word. We are going to continue along in the Gospel of Luke, and we are in chapter 22 today. This is a monumental chapter in this Gospel. It's a long chapter. It's over 60 verses. I'm not going to be able to cover every detail, but we'll kind of walk through a survey, and I want to highlight a couple of things going on here. First of all, now the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, which is called the Passover, was approaching. Of course, we knew Jesus came to Jerusalem to be the eternal Passover lamb, the perfect Passover lamb for us. And it says the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how they might put him to death. Why? It says, for they were afraid of the people. Now, this is really significant because the chief priests and scribes knew they didn't have anything on Jesus. They knew he was who he claimed he was, but they were afraid of losing their power hold, their stranglehold of power over the people. And so they were looking for ways to undermine him and to just to get rid of him. They were so corrupt and they were so hateful. And then, of course, verse 3, and Satan entered into Judas. That's the beginning right there of the betrayal, who was called Iscariot, belonging to the number of the 12. And he went away to discuss with the priests how this was all going to happen. So as we move along on this evening, this would have been Thursday of Passion Week. We come along to the Lord's table, and this is a significant moment for our church, for the church at large. And Jesus says, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. The disciples still didn't seem to get it. They still didn't seem to realize what was going on, even though he kept telling them, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to suffer. And so he gives them this feast of bread and of wine and other things with them. And he talks about the bread and the wine being the symbols of the new covenant. This cup, this bread is broken as my body for you. As often as you do this, eat this in remembrance of me. And he took the cup after he'd eaten, and he said, this cup which is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. And then he identifies Judas as the traitor, says, go do what you're going to do. And then in the midst of all this solemn moment of worship and of preparing his disciples for the knowledge that he was going to die, they get in an argument about who's the greatest. So you can see where their heart is. They want to be the greatest in the kingdom. Lord, who's going to, we want to be great with you is basically what they're saying. And we want to sit at your right hand and we want to do all these things. And Jesus is telling them, listen, if you want to be great, you need to be a servant first. Look to me. If you want to be great, you need to serve. Jesus said, I'm the one among you who's serving. Why are you worried about being great? And then he goes to Simon, to Peter. He says, Satan has already even asked me permission to sift you like wheat. And for those of you who've ever read Job, that's what Satan does. He goes to God's people and he tries to get them to reject their faith, to renounce their faith, and prove that they only love God because of blessing. And he predicts that Peter is going to betray him 3 times before the end here. And it fulfills prophecy. He says, for I tell you, this has to happen. I get it. It has to happen. Because it says, and he was numbered with the transgressors. This has to happen as a fulfillment here. And then they go up to the Garden of Gethsemane for prayer. This is where Jesus pours out his heart before the Lord in the timeline here and asks for the cup to be passed. But he says, not my will, Lord, yours be done. And this is such a wonderful prayer of submission to the will of his Father in heaven, because he knew that would bring God more honor. And he knew ultimately this was the pain and the suffering he would need to go through in order to ransom a people for his own possession. So then while they're in the garden, Judas shows up with this army, this monstrous army. This is the beginning of all of the illegal activity surrounding the trial of Jesus. If you've never read The Murder of Jesus by John MacArthur, it covers how they broke every single Jewish law and in order to hold this trial. And it was a completely illegal farce of a trial to find Jesus guilty. And Jesus went along with it because he knew he was there to die. So then in verse 54, Jesus is arrested. and his followers begin to abandon him. He's arrested. He is brought in for trial. And at the end of chapter 22, we find him in front of the Sanhedrin. And it says, when it was day, the council of elders, so now we know things have been happening overnight. That was illegal. The council of elders of people assembled, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to the council chamber, saying, if you're the Christ, tell us. Now they already knew, but he says, if I tell you, you will not believe. I've been mentioning it my whole ministry so far, and they're critical of his answers, of course, and they want to just find him guilty of whatever they can. And he says, and if I ask a question, you will not answer, but from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. And so they knew exactly what that meant. They all said, are you the Son of God then? And he said, I am. And then they said, what further evidence do we need? You're claiming to be equal to God. And so we have the testimony from his own mouth. And what they're trying to say here is you're committing blasphemy. But what they misunderstood was the whole progression of prophecies being fulfilled by Jesus, proving that he was the Messiah. And if they really knew their Old Testament, if they really knew the book of Isaiah and other messianic prophecies, they would know that all of this would fulfill the fact that the Messiah was, in fact, the Son of God, the servant of Yahweh, equal to God himself. So they weren't concerned with protecting the Old Testament or caring about God's word. They were concerned with protecting their false religious system. So that's important to keep in mind here as we read this one. Hopefully that clarifies that a little bit for you. As we go into the word tomorrow, we'll continue on into Luke 23. So hopefully that is encouraging to you. Have a blessed day. We'll see you tomorrow.